Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for your attention. Welcome to Rhodes House. My name's Cameron Hepburn. I'm a former Rhodes Scholar, which is the main reason I guess I'm standing here, but also Professor of Environmental Economics here at the university. We have just had a stupendously interesting, fascinating, provocative couple of days here in-house amongst the Rhodes Scholars to really sort through how we as a community can help tackle climate change and to meet the objective of the Paris Agreement to keep warming to well below 2 and indeed targeting 1.5. And this is our final event. We've had sessions on art and climate change, sessions on activism, politics, business, economics, and technology. So we've covered many of the bases, and of course we started with the science, not to exist in a non-scientific vacuum. And it has been very illuminating. And one of the things I've taken away thus far is that leadership really matters here in this community, and Oxford as an institution can and should do more to lead on this dimension, on this challenge, and that relationships also matter enormously. And so do talk to your neighbours afterwards, engage vigorously with the panel that you're about to listen to and build those relationships. So my job really is to introduce the warden of Rhodes House, Charles Conn, who has been instrumental in getting not just these sorts of events happening at Rhodes House, but they're part of a wider vision that he has brought to the Trust, which I think certainly I find incredibly welcome, to tackle the great problems of humankind, to fight the world's fight, which is in the will of Cecil Rhodes. And I won't go into his long and distinguished CV before becoming Warden of Rhodes Trust, other than to say it's incredibly varied and very interesting. And from an environmental point of view, he's not without some history here as well, having spent quite a while with the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation tackling, well, whether it's saving salmon or doing all sorts of other things. So Charles, I'm going to welcome you. Thank you very much for moderating this panel, and the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you, Cameron, and thanks everybody for being here. Really appreciate it. As Cameron said, the goal of this evening, as was true for the rest of the weekend, is to tackle this incredibly important problem. The world faces many challenges right now, but we don't get to work on all the other challenges if we don't figure this one out. So it seems the hierarchy of challenges is always a difficult thing to do, but this one seems particularly important. I'm just about to introduce the panelists, and each of them are experts in various domains, all united by the common purpose of trying to steer the arc of the planet toward a more sustainable future. We're at Oxford University, which is a place that prides itself on asking difficult questions and having vigorous debates and arguments about those questions. And we think that approach to life tends to yield better results than other ways. In that spirit, we've devised some pretty difficult questions to ask each of the panelists. And so the way we'll conduct the conversation today is I'll ask, after introducing them and asking them to say a few words about what they do, I'll ask each of them a question, and then one of them will answer that question and the others will discuss it for just a couple of minutes. And then we'll open up the floor to all of your questions. And I'd expect that we'll be finished before 5:30, although Congressman Esty needs to leave around 5 o'clock for pressing matters of state. So.
Flight spec.
So without much more than that, let me introduce each panelist. So first of all, Elizabeth Esty is a U.S. representative in the 5th Congressional District, Connecticut, a district that has both a strong manufacturing tradition and a growing number of small and green jobs, and she is encouraging both. She's a graduate of Harvard and Yale Law School, and before her current role, did a number of roles, including teaching in healthcare and medical policy at Yale and American University, and before that also served before the Supreme Court bar, so she has a rich and interesting background. Claire Shakya is the director of the IIED's Climate Change Group and has for more than 25 years worked in this area. And previous to her current role, she spent 15 years at DFID, where she advised and led the Asia and Africa Division's climate change response. She's also responsible for oversight of the propositional research by IIED's climate change group and their strategy to deliver SDGs in what we hope is a 1.5 degree world. Dr. Varun Sivaram is a Rhodes Scholar, in fact, overlapped with the beginning of my tenure, who's done quite a lot of things since then. He's the Douglas Dillon Fellow in the program on energy security and climate change at the Council for Foreign Relations. And before that, worked both with the governor's office in New York with Andrew Cuomo in reforming the energy vision for New York, and with the mayor of Los Angeles, Antonio Villaraigosa, in both energy and water policy, as well as stints at McKinsey & Company. He's a Stanford-educated engineer and did his physics DPhil here. Notably did his DPhil in 2 years, which I thought was impossible, but he did it. And can I also introduce Miles Allen? Miles is a professor of geosystem science in the School of Geography and Environment here in Oxford, and he's head of the Climate Change Dynamics Group. He also served on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and is lead author in the Detection of Climate Change and Attribution of Causes for the third assessment as far ago as 2001, and then more recently for the assessment in 2007. So please join me in welcoming those panelists to the conversation. So why don't we just start with you, Elizabeth, in order, and just can you say 2 or 3 minutes on your work around climate change and how climate change affects your work?
Absolutely. Well, thank you again. It's a really great pleasure to be out of Washington and to be here with you. And on a beautiful day, I'm amazed that you came in, knowing the forecast for the rest of the week. Well, I serve on the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, which has become the fault line in the U.S. Congress, regrettably and kind of shockingly, given that it used to be an incredibly bipartisan committee, and it is my most partisan committee at this point. And we are really seeing the fault lines on climate has become the singular fault line in Congress. If there's one, it is on that. And that is deeply regrettable and wrong, but it is where it is right now. There was the climate march yesterday, the scientist march yesterday,
yeah.
and which was indicative of kind of where these issues are. So I think we face dual challenges on this. And on what has been phrased by others as the McKibben versus Dan Esty side of the line, I would say both matter. That we are going to need, and I'll go into this more depth when I have a chunk of time, but we need the political activism that you see from the true believers, from the already converted and passionate. And that matters, and it matters more now because of networks and social media, accountability, economic pressure on companies. It's getting harder and harder to hide. Think Bhopal, but think what happens now if somebody dumps someplace, and we see it. And that matters. It also has shown that activism can work to change elections, and it's less about money and more about activation. Politicians care about winning elections. If they can do it without money, believe me, I will be the first one to sign up. And most politicians would as well. So I think that matters a lot. However, in the day-to-day and given where we are right now with the divides, we also have to work on persuasion. And for persuasion, you cannot use the arguments that appeal to you most morally at your core and the already converted. You need to use the arguments and the mindset of people who aren't already with you. And that can be really hard to do when you care as passionately as you do. And that's much of the challenge that I face every day as somebody who spent the first Earth Day pulling tires out of the San Francisco Bay as a young child and worked for the Natural Resources Defense Council on water issues when nobody else was in the 1980s. Now in Congress, I am constantly having to shift gears between this defense of basic science and standing up for what is right and values, and on the other hand, being able to talk to my Republican colleagues in ways that will allow them to fund basic science about climate and to stand up for some of these issues and think about it more in the nature of, and I'll turn it over on this. I say, listen, I've never lived in a house that is burned to the ground, and yet I carry insurance on my house. We live on planet Earth. You may think the risk is really low, but it's not zero. Even your scientists say it's not zero. Shouldn't, given the magnitude of the risk, that we are burning down the house of every single creature on Earth, shouldn't we actually take that seriously and carry a little bit of insurance?
Thank you.
And more later.
Thank you, and thanks, Charles, for the introduction. I want to jump off where Congresswoman Esty left off. I believe that the fault lines on science are the most important problem and potential solution that we face in the fight against climate change, bar none. And I want to tell you a little bit about my background to motivate that conclusion. When I was at Oxford finishing up, I was lucky to work for probably the hottest scientists, if not in Europe, then around the world. The second most cited scientist in the world, Henry Snaith, who's invented a new solar material that one day you could unspool from an industrial printer, much like you make newspapers. It's a very cool technology, and I was inspired. But around the same time as I graduated, both of the companies that I'd worked for in Silicon Valley that were innovative solar startups had just gone bankrupt, and venture capitalists had pulled almost all of their money, having lost over half of the $25 billion they invested prior to that date. So I saw no real opportunities to work on innovative solar technologies, and had I started my own venture, there wouldn't have been forthcoming funding. So I switched to the policy space, and I believed that the public policy, the potential for public policy to solve this issue is tremendous. I worked with the governor of New York on trying to encourage utilities to be more innovative. Utilities kind of are the gatekeeper in the electric power industry for new technologies. They by themselves are not particularly innovative or prone to innovation, but the biggest voice in their ear is the governments that regulate them around the world. So I learned the power of public policy, and now at the Council on Foreign Relations, I study both domestic energy innovation policy in the United States, and I also study global innovation policy. I believe that the single most important breakthrough we made at Paris was not in the negotiated text. It was rather on the sidelines, on day one of the Paris Climate Change Conference in 2015, when 20 world leaders, along with Bill Gates and his 28 billionaire friends, agreed on a public-private partnership called Mission Innovation, where countries around the world would double their research and development funding, and the private sector would also contribute funds. So that's what I want to work on, is finding ways to plug the gap where private investment is not going to push innovation where it needs to get to. And that's what I study at the Council. I'm also writing a book on the future of solar power. I've asked most people in this room to give me a good title idea, but I'm still waiting for it, so I'd appreciate your help.
Thanks, Varun. Claire?
Thank you. So my first day going up to university to do my undergraduate degree at UEA, Thatcher did her first speech on climate change, and she started off by saying, climate change is a thing, and then she told everyone to go out and pick up litter. So that's where we started back in '88. And that was October. In November, I was asked by a young PhD student to help him draw a map of sea level rise and what that would look like for the UK. And as I drew this map of 1 metre, 2 metre, and 3 metre sea level rise, I cut out most of the cities and most of the industrial production of the UK. And I came away from doing this map, and it's still there if you ever see the map KR, it's actually me that drew the lines. It was his PhD though, and we're still friends. Coming out of that, I really couldn't work out how do you make progress, because there was no jobs titled climate change. Let's act now. There was nobody saying, this is a real problem, we've got to put some finance here. So I started by working on food security, on energy security, and I do think that a lot of the people that don't believe in climate change could still be persuaded to do the right things just for the basic, simple reasons that we have to get our systems to work. We have to have food, we have to have energy, we have to have water, and all of those systems actually require different ways of doing things. The technology changes that have happened recently are perhaps some of the most exciting things that are changing the whole game at the moment. The utility is the ultimate gatekeeper on energy, but in some of the countries where they are so corrupt and it's impossible to get real change, like Tanesco in Tanzania, you are seeing them become less and less important because off-grid energy, mini-grids are coming in and providing an alternative that is actually providing energy for people in the forms that they need it at the times that they need it. Reliable energy is the secret to economic activity. So I do think that we're in a moment of great change. I do think there are arguments that can sway even those that prefer to not to believe that actually there is something fundamentally about to happen to our societies if we don't react. But I also think we have to get the finance to flow. And I know from our work in IID that it's not going to the right places, the right countries, or the right things at this point. So we need, for technology solutions to help us, we actually need them to be funded. And for that to happen, we need society to demand real fundamental changes to the way decisions are made.
Thank you. Miles?
Thank you. I'm known to many of you who are still here, and I've been working on climate change for research since the late 1980s. I can start to measure my career in tenths of a degree, which I find rather depressing. Just while I've got your attention, though, I would, on a sort of less depressing note, I think apparently there's a sort of debate about whether this can be framed as sort of McKibben versus Esty. I mean, this sort of optimistic versus gloomy view of the problem. Those who know me will know that I try very hard to give people what seems to me to be a sort of central estimate of where we are. I'm happy to talk to people about the ranges of uncertainty as well, but I do think we, particularly the sort of the Bill McKibbens of this world, are rightly very worried about possibilities, and the insurance analogy is a very good one, but that doesn't necessarily mean that, but worrying too much about the most extreme possibilities is almost paralyzing. And I'm particularly concerned with the recurrent meme, which is around at the moment, that we've only got 5 years left. And interestingly, it was still 5 years left last year as well. We've only got 5 years left before we blow the 1.5 degree carbon budget. That may be true, but it's certainly not the central estimate. It's certainly not the most likely response of the climate system. A much more balanced way of thinking about it is we're at about 1 degree now. So we're halfway to 2 degrees, we're 2/3 of the way to 1 degree. Mind you, we're changing the system much faster now than we were over the past 250 years while we were ramping it up to 1 degree. But it's certainly not all over, and the many voices that are already piping up saying the only way to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement is immediate geoengineering, which is that there are plenty of people out there starting to say this. Because the budget's used up, therefore the only option is sun shields in space to keep the planet cool. That I find worrying. And this is a very sort of dangerous implication from an overly pessimistic view of where we're at on science. So that's my sort of cheer up everybody point. The other side, which is perhaps slightly, that's me speaking as a scientist. As somebody working in this area inevitably thinks a bit about the policy response, my gloomy comment is if we carry on doing what we're doing, addressing climate change in the way that all governments, including the most progressive on climate change, are attempting to address it, we're not even going to make 2 degrees. The simple reason is that we're focusing on lots and lots of different things, all of which matter for climate, and we're still completely ignoring the elephant in the corner, which is what is actually going to happen to the fossil fuel industry and the assets that it owns underground, and that many countries' citizens own underground, and that many pensioners own underground, which everyone has every intention of using. And I think that the problem is, unless that issue is made front and central, the question we need to resolve before all else on climate change, we're really never going to make progress on this problem. And I think that's where I think the policy focus should be. So not with Henry Snaith. Although I think Henry Snaith is doing wonderful things to secure our energy future, you could make an argument that solar power, renewables, and so on, this renewables revolution going on in China, is actually irrelevant to the problem of climate change, as long as we keep planning to use all those stocks of fossil carbon that are sitting underground waiting to get dug up and burnt.
Thank you. Why don't we move toward the 4 questions that I'd like to ask the panel. I'll ask each of you a question, and then after that answer, we'll kick it around. You do represent a fascinating set of perspectives. I guess we get to start sort of at the shallow end of the pool. Trump. Elizabeth, it's not fair to ask you this question, but you do serve in Congress. Both houses of the legislature in the United States are controlled by a party that often denies climate change and certainly doesn't fund solutions toward climate change. We have a president who's asked the question about whether we should remain in the Paris Accords at all. What is the world to do when the biggest economy doesn't act responsibly with regard to its prior commitments?
I'm glad that was such an easy question. Well, I think what we've seen, among other things, what Donald Trump says this morning is not necessarily what he says tonight or tomorrow morning. So that's the good and the bad news there. As you may have seen, immediately after announcements about that, a number of major corporations said, we frankly don't care what the president does. We are going forward because we see a business imperative to do that. And I think, for better and worse, that is, we are going to see American businesses, most of which have already decided to move forward. And that includes a number of the big fossil fuel companies who at the same time they were deep-sixing research about climate science, something that Bill McKibben is fighting, fighting some very expensive subpoenas right now to address this. At the same time, they are moving forward with renewable investments because they want to be in the energy business and they want to be in business 100 years from now and they want to make money. So that's the good and the bad news about what's going to happen. I think in the short term, we're going to continue to see, a rise of regional blocks. There's already the RGGI group that includes basically the Northeast and the West Coast, and a few other states in between. So I think you're going to see a resurgence of states. When one of the states is California, the world's 6th or 7th largest economy, that moves a lot of things. And so if you want to meet standards in California, just as the textbooks writers found it in a not good way around science, around evolution to meet the Texas market, a lot of companies are going to find if they want to meet the California market as they did for cars, that drove the standards, as it were. So I think we're in an era where you're going to see, for better and for worse, the resiliency of states' rights. You're going to see the Jeffersonian model. And it's also going to include cities. It's going to include provinces in Canada. It's going to include subnational jurisdictions, something Claire talked about, and major corporations, which have a bigger footprint than most countries do. And those who see it in their advantage, or conversely, and this has to do with, in part, people's movements, like what Bill has been doing, lead such economic and political pressure that companies feel they must respond. And they have to respond because of the lack of goodwill if they don't. And frankly, it's a global search for talent now. That's leading to enormous political and economic disequilibrium, but it also means for the globally diverse young people in this room, you don't want to go work for a climate-destroying, planet-destroying company, and you're not going to go there. And guess what? They care about that. They want you. And so that has its own separate lever of pressure. So I think we're going to see resiliency and innovation. Frankly, the Democratic Party has been too focused at the federal level, too top-down in terms of governance, as a party, but also in terms of putting so many eggs in the basket of federal government. And I think we're going to see a resurgence, and a necessary one, of ground-up effort. And we're seeing that politically, which is very encouraging and very necessary. That may allow us to use technology, whether it's things like sensors, which could be a much cheaper way, a more effective way to monitor water quality, for example. We're going to need microgrids to deal with India, where I went with a bipartisan group of Congress 2 months ago, where there are as many people living in India with no power as there are Americans living in the United States. That's a huge market. Well, we're going to need to use microgrids for resiliency there. Why build this huge, massive infrastructure of the sort we have in the United States? Makes no sense. If you're going to build that infrastructure, it should be accommodating resiliency. I'm sure you're going to talk more about it. It's really important. This question of the assets, we've got to figure out the question of the assets. That's a really important one. That's going to require some global governance, but it's also going to require markets, and it's also going to require innovation. Because, you know, when push comes to shove, India and China are going to want to burn that coal. And if we don't find some better way to actually do carbon capture and sequestration, it could get really ugly really fast. So there are imperatives out there, and I'm an optimist. I wouldn't be in Congress if I weren't. America has survived a civil war, which decimated our population, 2 world wars, the Great Depression, Cold War. We will survive Donald Trump. Okay. No, we will, and we're seeing it right now. We're seeing it right now. So honestly, you know, but we're seeing it. I'm equally or more concerned about Marine Le Pen today, where a third of her campaign is financed by the Russians. These efforts around the world are serious, and they pose a challenge to democracies and capitalism everywhere. And that's a much greater question about the pace of technology, the role of work, what place we have for people in an Uber economy where you have multi-billionaires who employ 22 people. That is a huge threat, I think, to stabilization and governance that is as big as this question about climate. And hopefully they will resolve in ways that involve more people all across the world in having a say in what the future looks like. So I'm an optimist. We will get through this, but it's not going to be pretty this week when we try to keep the government open. Yeah. Solve healthcare and do tax reform this week.
Thank you, Congressman Esty. I really appreciate that. Can we just open that up to the other panelists? So, and it doesn't need to just be about the United States. As we move forward over the next 15 or 20 years, there's chance for defection by any one of the powerful players. China, India, Europe could easily be in disarray or cease to exist as we know it today. Do you think that we can hold together the sense of goodwill that there was at Paris to drive toward this 1.5 or 2 world? Are the institutions of government and international government up to the challenge? So whoever would like to start first.
Well, I'd be delighted to jump in on that one.
No,
but
go on, you go first, Miles.
So I often thought that there's very little. It's very easy to stay in Paris. That the cost of complying with the Paris Agreement is, many people don't realize this, is essentially you promise to report your emissions and what you're trying to do about them. That's really the only major obligation that Paris imposes on the parties. Now, so if there was any cost, real cost of leaving, I think countries would be very reluctant to do so. Now, some in the US administration, I think, have already seen that there is potential cost in leaving. I mean, Tillerson has come out very explicitly saying he's very concerned about what would happen if the US left. But I've often wondered, why don't we have, it would be rather pointless at the moment, but it might become relevant soon, a label saying made in regions, I'd say regions, not necessarily countries, to be fair to California, made in regions and sourced from materials from regions that support the Paris Climate Agreement. Very simple little logo. They've even got this little leaf thing which you could use if you could persuade the French government to allow you to. And would that make any difference? Well, for a lot of companies for whom the cost of their region complying with the Paris Agreement is virtually zero, they might be pretty upset if they suddenly had to start taking this logo off their products. So I'd like to think that that sort of thing might start before we get on to Sarkozy's trade wars. I think that's going a little bit far. Good.
Thank you, Miles. Claire?
Okay, so if the US was to leave Paris, who's going to be hurt most? The US. For the very reasons that you talk about, Miles. The cost of coal is more expensive than the cost of renewables in almost every country that's had an auction in the last year and a half. or even 3 years, the coal is coming in as the more expensive technology now. We've got, and that's Latin America, Asia, Africa, have all had auctions where coal's come in as more expensive. So that would mean that the cost of energy to the US citizen goes up if they insist on, if Trump insists on trying to make it a coal-based economy. The other thing is that the renewable energy jobs are actually they're 5 times greater, aren't they, than the coal jobs in the US? But that's a growing phenomenon across the world. China sees this as a big market opportunity. They have been gearing up for a long time now to be the major manufacturer of clean tech. If they are the major manufacturer of clean tech, then they're going to be getting the benefit of everyone else acting on Paris. If the US, or indeed the UK, don't stay on top of the game right now, they're going to be losing the potential to be part of the new manufacturing areas of growth. Federal action is actually proven to be less, well, in a federal country like the United States, indeed like India, it's actually quite hard for the federal governments to make changes that actually change behaviours on the ground, the sorts of behaviours you need to see. So in fact, Trump's gears and sticks to create change just aren't that many. So maybe it doesn't matter. The business action, the Renewable Energy 100, so a bunch of companies, the really large companies around the world have all committed that they will go to 100% renewable energy. If those companies cannot get renewable energy in the US, will they be manufacturing in the US? Well, maybe not. Maybe they'll be coming to Europe. Maybe they'll be going to other countries. So I think there's all sorts of reasons to say that actually if Trump was to either leave the UNFCCC, because that's the fastest way of leaving Paris, or was just to say, look, we're just not going to do anything, that it's actually the US that would be missing out.
Thank you. Varun.
Let me make 3 points. So what do we need out of our institutions? First, I think our institutions need to be resilient to things like this happening, one or more major countries pulling out. We've talked a little bit about Paris, but let me talk about mission innovation. Again, I think that's the most important area where we need institutional support. Mission innovation was basically an Obama-era creation. The United States Department of Energy hosts the secretariat that conducts the operations of this institution. It is unclear whether they'll be allowed to do that anymore. And hence we have this institution that's not very resilient to a political change in its basically sponsoring country. So in the future, we need to redesign this institution. So perhaps its funding is more decentralized, its operations are more decentralized. So one country leaving the club is not going to doom the entire initiative. The second thing we need out of our institutions is that they are our climate and energy institutions need to be compatible with other sorts of international institutions. So Miles just talked about, wouldn't it be cool if we had a label that said, comes from a region that complies with the Paris Agreement? And the logical extension to that is, can't we have a system of trade barriers such that you might have folks within a climate club and folks outside of a climate club, and the ones within can trade freely and the ones outside cannot? That seems like a good idea from implementing a truly global carbon tax, fully with a system of border adjustments. But it's a terrible idea given our current World Trade, WTO set of rules. So we're going to have to think about this coming clash of institutional frameworks that are good for climate and energy and ones that are good in other areas. My final point, I'm going to kind of throw a bomb here. Claire gave us a few reasons for why it's a bad idea for Trump to either pull out of the Paris Agreement or do nothing on the home front. But I want to make sure we're being analytically honest here. Trump's domestic announcements so far have been things like, I will no longer continue to implement the Clean Power Plan, right? In and of itself, that doesn't actually do anything bad to American jobs. It happens to remove a regulation. It's not clear to me that that would reduce the job creation potential of renewables. Renewables, by the way, are going to do just fine in the United States, whether or not we have the Clean Power Plan. More coal plants would have shut down had we had the Clean Power Plan. But again, Claire mentioned manufacturing in the United States. If the United States wants manufacturing, it better invest in innovation because we're not going to manufacture today solar panels, wind turbines, or batteries. China's already won that game. We need to be investing in the next generation. That next generation may very well be made in very highly automated factories, but our only shot at job creation is going to be in advanced products, not today's products.
Yeah.
Thank you. Really appreciate that. I'd like to shift gears now, though, and move away from the the institutions of large governments and talk a little bit about, from Claire's background, the most vulnerable countries, because most of the costs of climate change so far are being borne not by those who've benefited from industrialization and globalization, but those who are most vulnerable. So that includes low-lying states, island countries, and many of the places where the increase in temperature has already had a significant impact on agriculture. I wonder if you might comment, based on your experience, on is that recognized adequately by those of us in the developed world? What obligations the developed world should have specifically to those countries and to those people who are most affected? I mean, arguably, what's happening in Somalia and in other places like that are already the fruits of climate change. Will you comment on that?
Sure. Okay, so the Paris Agreement in some ways is the recognition, the global recognition, that, that this is a real problem for some of the poorest countries of the world. And in IID, our focus is the 48 least developed countries, so that negotiating bloc. And they as a group managed to bring about the 1.5 degree being an aim of Paris. The 2 degree was what was the big emitters wanted to talk about. And the poorest countries said, no, 2 degrees just is not enough ambition. We need to be aiming for more than that. And that was agreed. It is just an aim. And as Miles says, the only thing that is required in Paris is that everyone reports on how they're doing against a set of goals that aren't enough to achieve 1.5 in the first place. So it's not about just recognition, it's about how do we get action that is consistent with 1.5. My biggest concern about the climate change world is that for those working on the science, they're doing some great evidence, but all of those of us who work in the planning are just wandering around planning. We've been planning for years. Every time there's an agreement for something like a climate change action, everyone goes off and spends 5 years planning. When does the action happen? So,
yes, Minister.
yeah. So I think it's really important that we really focus on action and not plans. I don't care how good the plans for Paris, or the NDCs as they're called, are. It doesn't matter. What were the actions that are making a difference? Which ones are going furthest and fastest? And how can we replicate those at speed? The 100 billion that the richest countries agreed to give the poorest countries is far too little. Just the 48 poorest countries need exactly, well, just under 100 billion for what they need every year. Most of that 100 billion has to be from the private sector, and the private sector just do not invest in the poorest countries. They don't invest in the hardest things, and they don't invest in the riskiest things. So the public finance has to be going to the things that are hardest to do, to bring the private investment in. And as I was saying yesterday, sorry to bore you for those that have already heard it, of all the climate commitments made to date, only 11% has been dispersed to date. 11% of these great big billions that everyone keeps talking about. For the poorest countries, they have seen 5% commitments. Just of all the energy commitments that have been made to date, only 5% are committed for the poorest countries. Even in adaptation, which is the smallest flow of finance, only 40% is for the poorest countries, less than half of the thing that the poorest countries need most and is actually being designed as a financial flow for the poorest countries, less than half actually goes to the poorest countries. And then finally, if you consider that actually to get real change to happen, you need finance to flow to the local level, to change local economies, local people's behaviours, local investments, only 10% is committed with the purpose of reaching the local level. So the financial flows are flowing all wrong at the moment, and we need a lot more political attention to this. We need countries that are still planning to provide international climate finance, unlike the US and sadly also unlike the UK under Theresa May. We need to see those that are still prepared to provide it, providing it in ways that reach the poorest countries and that reach the local level and reach the things where action can take place. Now, the final thing I want to talk about, just because I knew Miles was here, was loss and damage. So I'll just very quickly. There's a whole debate within the climate change sphere around if the poorest countries are suffering changes that are so fundamental that their local economies can no longer persist, that's irreversible damage to their ability to thrive, then they should be compensated. This has been a debate that's been going on since the beginning of time in the climate change sphere. But for the first time at Paris, loss and damage was actually recognised as an issue. There has been some progress, thanks to people like Miles, doing some analysis of climate shocks to be able to say how much is actually attributable to climate change, to human-induced climate change, to really begin to get a sense of what sorts of financial flows are we talking about if there was compensation. The thing is, though, that actually how you get this finance to flow, even if there was some sort of compensation made, we still don't, as I said before, the development finance isn't flowing to the right place, the climate finance isn't flowing to the right place. Why would I believe that the loss and damage finance might flow to the right place? So I think what's most important is not really whether or not there should be some sort of compensation mechanism, but is to think about the mechanisms by which we get risk finance that's available today, like insurance, to flow in ways that actually change the incentives around risk and action all the way down. So what mechanisms can reach the very poorest people? What mechanisms can pull climate risk up a supply chain and make a fundamental difference to the way food markets or other markets are operating? And the final piece of this is mobility. So at the moment, in the loss and damage world, everyone keeps talking about how are we going to help the country. Sorry, there's a lot to cover in that particular field. Talking a lot about climate refugees, I think we should be talking about mobility, enabling mobility with dignity, enabling social, social mobility is something that we celebrate had celebrated in Europe until Brexit, that you could go where the jobs were. How can we support the poorest people that don't have social networks that enable them to go to where the jobs are, actually get to where the jobs are? And then maybe it won't be so much about loss and damage as this big problem, and more about all the ways we've helped people move to where the opportunity is.
Thank you. I wonder if I can ask maybe Miles first to comment on that. So, climate reparations, distribution questions, how do we think about this?
Reparations is a very loaded word, but I do think
on purpose.
Yeah, I know. So I'm not going to answer. I wouldn't be qualified. There's people much better qualified to talk about whether you should use the word reparations here. But I do think it's interesting that we go to considerable lengths to quantify what climate change, what different countries and indeed what different people are doing to the climate. You can go on a website and discover what your carbon footprint is. Your country has to report every year to the UNFCCC what its emissions are. And yet we have no idea what climate change is doing to us, which I find slightly odd. And that's something which I feel there should be much more discussion about. Countries should know how much they are being affected by climate change. They deserve to know, and people deserve to know. I'm somewhat... It's interesting, maybe it's a longer conversation, happy to take it up with people afterwards, as to why we have spent so much of the focus so far on finding out who to blame than actually working out what climate change is doing. And I think one of the issues really is that we've had this mantra for decades that this is a global problem, it affects everybody. Actually, the sort of scary truth is it isn't. It does affect everybody, but it affects some people so much more than it affects others that the information about how it's affecting you is potentially quite explosive. But can we rely on people remaining in ignorance of this information forever and just not minding and not asking the question about whether they're being affected by climate change when they're not really contributing to the problem? I don't think we can. I think we need to get that information out there so that people can start to talk about it. Whether it means reparations or I don't know. But the longer we put off the discussion about who's being affected and pretending, oh, it's affecting everybody, let's not talk about it, whether it's affecting this country more than it's affecting that one, then the more explosive the issue will be when it finally comes up.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it is interesting how often people only start to care about something if it affects the health of their children, for example, and maybe that is the kind of message that's needed in order to begin to address these distributional questions.
I mean, I've given public talks in Oxfordshire pointing out to people that climate change is affecting the risk of flooding in Oxfordshire, and therefore it will, depending on what postcode they have and even where they are in the street, climate change may affect them a lot or not affect them at all. And interestingly, even though you're giving people some information that's loaded with uncertainty, basically I'm having to tell them, I have no idea whether climate change is going to affect you personally, but if it does affect you personally, it'll affect you a lot and it won't affect your neighbors. People get really upset about that. Because the idea there's a possible risk that might clobber them and won't clobber their neighbors, that's really bad. A sort of risk of sea level rise in 100 years, that's going to affect everybody. Let's not worry about it, okay? But something which might affect me next year and won't affect my neighbors, those smug gits who live up the hill, that's a problem.
Thank you.
And I should say, I live in the floodplain.
With an interest in time, I'd love to move on to the next question. And Varun, you've written a lot about the need to massively scale up funding for technology innovation in the energy space. And I know you believe that technology breakthroughs are some of the most hopeful solutions for addressing the climate change crisis. How do you balance your thoughts on technological solutions to the problem with the need for societal transformation, for behavioral transformation in our other practices? How do you think about that conundrum of clean energy innovation being compatible with also us making the social transformations that we need to make?
That's a great question. Thank you. Let me first start by saying I think that an energy transition for the world that achieves deep decarbonization, this is 80 to 100% lower emissions by some point in the future. We say in the power sector by 2050, for the rest of the sectors sometime in the second half of the century. It's absolutely crucial to solve the problem. And this is an enormous transition. And trying to make that transition with the existing technologies will be expensive, complicated, and highly unpopular. So I'll start from the premise that, and we can debate this later on, I'll start from the premise that we absolutely need innovation. Let me make a quick detour to discuss something that Miles said earlier on, then I'll answer your question. Miles, I don't think Miles and I disagree. I think we completely agree, but let me be clear on why. Renewable energy is a crucial component of this energy transformation, and in order for renewable energy to materially displace fossil fuels, it will need to look different than it does today. I can explain that later. But that's only one part of the solution. The other part of the solution is we probably still need to use fossil fuels. We may still need to use them because people have vested interests, like stranded assets. We may need to use them because we're just pretty good at using fossil fuels right now. And the way to do it is through, for example, carbon capture and sequestration. So that's another part of the solution. I don't think that there's an either or here and that you and I disagree. It is very important to push innovation in renewable energy, as well as carbon capture and sequestration. Now, how does this fit in with our societal transformations that you brought up? Well, I think I mentioned one societal transformation, which is we need to transform our energy sector, and that will require new technologies. So they work hand in hand. Energy innovation is a necessary, though insufficient, condition for societal transformation in terms of energy. What else? Well, we heard over this weekend many other types of societal transformations. For example, people need to be more sustainable, or people need to reduce their energy consumption, or people need to be more responsible. I actually don't know if I agree with any of these statements. I am an extremist, I'm a techno-optimist, and I happen to believe that if I can give you a ton of clean electrons, I don't care how many electrons you use. Feel free to be wasteful. But there are certain things that are very important in terms of behavioral shifts that will help us transition. So for example, I want an electricity system where every appliance connected to the edge of the grid works in concert with the sources that supply electrons. They can work and ramp up and down so that we always match supply and demand, and we can absorb highly variable solar and wind energy because your thermostat went up and down automatically. Now, that's today considered a behavior shift, change your thermostat. I want it to be solved by technology. I don't want you to have to worry about this. I do not believe that behavior shifts are going to drive the transformation. I do believe that political shifts will drive them, but only insofar as you vote in people who invest in innovation. I believe that innovation is fundamentally necessary, and I don't even know if it's insufficient, maybe insufficient, to solve this problem.
Thank you. You're going to have to go in a minute. I wonder if I might turn to you to comment on that.
I think I'm probably a little bit...
You have youthful optimism next to you. What do you think?
Well, I'm a bit in that camp as well. I mean, the way I think about it is this. The entire world, the new economy, is going to run on information, and that requires energy. The argument I make to my Republican colleagues is, why in the world, when the U.S. is 5% of the market, would we not be investing in developing the technology that 100% of the world's going to need? So I do it from that aspect about saying the imperative for innovation. I don't even talk about climate change. I talk about China, going fast down that road. I talk about having just been in India, where there's this huge market of English-speaking people as a counterweight to China and Russia. Now, I will say one thing about the innovation piece, about the interconnected, the Internet of Things. And having attended a lot of cybersecurity briefings, I have to tell you there is grave concern about that, and I have grave concern about that. So if any of you has not yet chosen a career path, go into cybersecurity. We cannot possibly hire enough people, and I'm not kidding. This is a very serious concern. Russia, you name it, Bulgarian gangs, I don't care who it is, but it's pernicious, it's dangerous, and we will not be able to actually benefit from this unless we fix that problem. So I am an optimist. I sell it in different ways depending on who my audience is, because again, it's where people are, it's what they worry about. Why should we not use that?
Yeah.
They don't have to care about hugging trees as long as we get towards policies that are actually hire more people, employ people who can pay their bills, and you know what, at the same time, maybe you have the benefit too of helping save the planet.
Yeah.
I care a lot about that. But we should all care about people having jobs. People who have jobs are more invested in the future.
Yeah.
They don't burn down the sole tree left in their yard. So it is, rising income levels around the world are essential, which is why I do want to have people to have access. I don't care if they waste energy as long as it's free. So we need the solar energy. Actually, I want to talk to you about beaming it down from space, which is what my son wants us to do. And they're looking at it in Google X, some of these proposals to beam it down. And we should be looking to make it free and available to everyone. And then we'll need less stuff. That's the last thing I want to say. I do think we're moving into an economy where the West has overly materialized and is dematerializing in profound ways. And to the extent that the rest of the world is looking for what do rich countries do, we're dematerializing. So that actually makes me a little more optimistic, because I think, you tend to pattern what you see as those who are very privileged. What are they doing? Everybody I know is decluttering right now. They're looking to have less. And the MIT scientists who I meet with tell me, we won't have a closet in 5 years because we're going to take our clothes, drop them into the shredder, and 3D print something new tomorrow. I'm not kidding you. That's what they're talking about doing. And, who would love to not have to deal with the closet? And I was reminded here in Balliol, you don't even have them. So it would be useful not to have a closet. So again, technology absolutely needs to be part of it. My greatest concern, too, is that we will not be investing in technology in the profound ways we need to get us out of this.
Thank you. You must go.
Thank you. Thank you all very much, and
Thank you.
pray for America. Thank you.
I'm mindful that we'd like to turn to the audience, but I wonder, Miles, just before doing that, if I can ask you, you've been an influential member of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and there's an incredibly important role for climate scientists to provide the facts. How do you think about the sort of the role of the tension that's inherent in your kind of role between stating the facts and stating solutions? You have strong beliefs about what policy solutions are required. How do you walk that line so that you don't lose your credibility as a scientist?
Well, just very briefly, I don't think I should have to, just as I don't think that, we should refuse to allow judges to vote. I mean, why shouldn't they vote? I mean, I'm a citizen along with anybody else. What is important is I make it clear when I'm speaking as a scientist, and very clear on the very few occasions I speak on behalf of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and I should stress, absolutely nothing I've said today has anything to do with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. If one is clear on that, then I think that's the way to go. And if we and it is our job as scientists, and I will argue vehemently with any social scientists in the room who argue that everything we do is a social construct, or whatever sort of view you might have. It is our job as scientists, particularly as physical scientists, to report the facts as best we can. And no, I don't think facts are a social construct.
Thank you. Thank you. Unsadly appropriate thing to say. I wonder if either of you would like to comment on what Varun said just before we open it up to the panel. So he gave I mean, I think it's a fascinating perspective. Technology change is the answer, and we can't actually count on people to change their behavior, so let's change the technologies.
Well,
you want to go first, Claire?
I mean, I don't really see them as opposing forces. I think societal change is needed in order to create the market for the new technologies. Half the time, we have a very unlevel playing field. The fossil fuel industry have a lot of incentives that enable you to use their products very cheaply, when actually the renewable energy are having to go uphill. So but to change those things actually requires society demanding those changes. So I've been involved in some processes of trying to remove fossil fuel subsidies in small countries, not even, tiny countries like Nepal. It should be easy. It should be easy. It is so difficult. Lots of these countries that have really ambitious climate change targets and really ambitious statements about what they're going to do have yet to manage to remove some of the basic things. So it's not an either or. You need both, and you need to be an authentic leader as well in this space. I mean, climate negotiators, climate scientists, and people like me working on the climate policy have probably got the biggest carbon footprints of the world. It's really time we started showing the sorts of shifts that are required to create the market to bring the new technologies in.
Thank you. Miles, last comment?
Yeah, just on this, absolutely, I'm an optimist too. I think we need to invest in innovation. My concern is the big innovation that we need is to develop a capacity for gigascale CO2 disposal. Without this, we won't meet our climate goals, no matter what those climate goals are. And that's the one that is not been, is getting rid of CO2, burying it back underground, returning it back into rocks, whatever your favorite technology is. That is a tiny fraction of the climate innovation money that's spent at the moment is spent on that, and that is the determinant of whether we meet our climate goals. So we're spending a lot of money on things that we might need. We're spending almost no money on the one technology that we know we're going to need. The reason for this is because that technology is fiendishly expensive. The only institution in the world which would have the resources and the expertise to develop an ability for CO2 disposal at the scale we need to do it is the fossil fuel industry. And until they're required to get on with it, we're not going to solve the problem.
Thank you. Thank you. Really appreciate it. So can we thank our panelists for that part of the conversation? Really, really appreciate it. And what we'd like to do now is take some questions from the audience, and we've got about half an hour to do that. So can I ask that you raise your hand, and there are microphones that'll go around. Can you state your name and your affiliation? And if you could do your best, please, to keep the questions short and succinct, that would be great. Please. And stand up.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Olia. I'm an MSc in Environmental Change and Management here. My question is more specifically for Varun. It's about the innovation. When you're talking about it, are you sort of looking at it as large scale or more specifically Western-based, like innovation renewables in the US and the Western countries, or are you seeing it more as something that could be done smaller scale or community-based, and is that something that's potentially could be more sustainable?
Yeah, I'll answer with like a McKinsey 2x2. I don't think large equals Western and small equals non-Western. I think there's one axis for large and small and another axis for Western or developed and developing countries. And we need solutions in all four of these boxes. So you can imagine that we will need efficient air conditioners. These are small things, and these will be for the distributed, for the developing world. Very important. We will also need solar materials that can be both at the large scale and the small scale and apply both to the developed world and the developing world. I also think that developed countries should be working with developing countries. Our companies in the United States should be working on market creation in India and China. It's good for them, it's good for those countries as well. So basically my answer is I think we need all of the above in all of those four buckets, and I would hesitate to call large things only Western applications, because we really do need large-scale technologies in the developing world as well.
Good, thank you.
Hi, my name is Sam Peltz, and I'm a Master of Public Policy candidate here at Oxford. My question is also for Varun. Congresswoman Esty talked about the state resilience and also the local resilience, and we heard Mayor Eric Garcetti say last week in the State of the City that if they're not gonna, if they're gonna get out of Paris in the U.S., that they'll adopt it right here in L.A. So the question is, you worked on New York Rev. I'm wondering what lessons for the local and state contexts, both positive and negative, you learned from New York Rev, and how that can maybe be adapted to a larger global context.
Terrific question, thank you. I'll tell you one positive thing and one negative thing. On the positive front, institutions like New York have a lot of control over how their utilities, for example, function. Los Angeles controls its utility, it's a rare city, and New York also can regulate its utility. Most states can do that. And this is something that the federal government cannot do. So New York, what it tried to do, for those of you who may not know, is it created regulations so that its utility would use more distributed energy resources and fewer centralized resources, because oftentimes it's cheaper to have, for example, local microgrids running on solar panels and batteries than to build out really expensive substations and transmission and distribution lines. So I think that was a success, that New York was able to rewrite its regulations to encourage a 21st century grid. However, there is a failure when you try and think about solving large-scale problems. For example, in order to incorporate a lot of renewable energy onto our grids, we will need really big grids. A single state, and especially a single city, will not be able to build that grid. We will need multi-state, and in some cases, multi-country grids. Those are cases that don't fall within the jurisdiction of a subnational entity. And so that's why I think we need action at the state and local level over what they control, but also action at federal and international levels over those things. And we'll have kind of a hybrid approach to decarbonization.
Thank you. You had a question here?
My name is Jonathan Padilla from the great state of California. And I guess my question is off Miles' point. And Varun and maybe Miles, could you maybe tackle this? So I worked with Dan Schreck, who was from Harvard, and worked on the former President's Council of Science and Technology. And his whole notion is that we are not going to meet the timeline. And geoengineering is going to have to be a massive focus the next 30 to 40 years. Could you perhaps talk about some of the impediments, maybe in more depth, about the needs for innovation here and the policy impediments to really execute on this front, to buy time for, I think, Varun, your idea of a much more optimistic energy portfolio?
So, Miles, do you want to start?
Well, there's two things people call geoengineering. There's getting rid of large amounts of CO2, taking it back out of the atmosphere, and there's putting mirrors in space or setting up artificial volcanoes or whatever to interfere with incoming energy from the sun. The problem with the second one is that you are then transparently interfering with the world's weather. It's obvious who's doing it, because you couldn't really do this in secret. One of the advantages of it is it's astonishingly cheap, and a massive disadvantage is it's astonishingly cheap relative to taking CO2 back out of the atmosphere. Kim Jong-un would be more than capable of setting up a global geoengineering program. He has the technology to do it, because your missiles don't actually have to land. They just have to blow up in the stratosphere, which they do already. You know, when people start talking about geoengineering, they should bear in mind, yeah, anybody could do that. Do you really want to move in that direction? Taking CO2 back out of the atmosphere is hard. I would say on the sort of scale we need to do it in order to meet any of our climate goals, no country in the world actually could afford to even do the research required to get us to that scale. But there is one institution in the world which absolutely has the resources to do it. It's 10% of the world economy. It's the fossil fuel industry. I don't understand why we don't discuss this problem much more in terms of it's a waste disposal problem. These guys are selling a product that causes an undesirable side effect. It should be part of their job to get rid of it.
Thank you. Question back here.
Hello, I'm Arjit, and I'm pursuing a DPhil in engineering science. This is a continuation of your stance about asking the fossil fuel industry to tackle the CCS problem. Now, we have had in the earlier discussions about how the fossil fuel industry actively invests in renewables for having a profitable venture in the long run in the post-oil economy. Is it possible that you convince the fossil fuel industry to have a similar investment in carbon capture and storage by making CCS actually profitable in the long run? Essentially, is it possible to have CCS as a profitable industry in the long run?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
You need a carbon tax, and that's been something that people have been saying that we need a carbon tax for a very long time. If we price carbon in some way, then yes, CCS would actually suddenly become something that you could develop technologies in order to do. And Saudi Arabia is actually one of the countries that's meant to have the best resource for CCS. So, you know, it's a rich country. Could it do it? Could it make it something that it does? It could, but we need a way of pricing carbon. And the UK government has tried several times to introduce some better form of, some way of pricing carbon, and in every case we've ended up with not having a proper price of carbon. There's been a few other countries that have made attempts. We end up always with the lobbies coming in a way that just prevents us from moving forward. And I have to say, having been involved in trying to get some of these things off the ground for a really long time, I just don't have much hope that it's going to happen in the next 5 years.
If I could add on this, I completely agree with what Claire said. Carbon pricing is one way to make this profitable, but it is not the only one. The other way is to make carbon utilization profitable, and that requires, you guessed it, research and development into utilization of CO2. The three uses that I think could be most lucrative are incorporating carbon dioxide to make carbon fiber, which could be a key ingredient in planes and vehicles. 2 is cement curing. Believe it or not, you can use CO2 to cure cement, which is a very widely used product, obviously. And 3 is incorporating CO2 into liquid fuels. Again, we need to do more work on all three of these, but if these could become technically feasible, they would be very lucrative. You would want to capture the carbon and use it for these things.
Oh, good. Tim?
Not at the scales. Sorry? Not at the scales.
Tim Weiskell. I'm curious, in the discussion of CCS, why there's been an avoidance of the most obvious and continuous and proved technology, namely living plants. The whole point of fossil fuels is that it's fossilized CCS, right? And at the current structure of things internationally, we're actually expending fossil fuels to destroy topsoils, which are the biggest bank of carbon, far bigger than the atmosphere. If, again, we get Dan on it, sort of, change the incentives, the green lights, the red lights, couldn't we reorganize agriculture to become less, not just less petro-intensive, but actually carbon stored focused on building topsoils, building fertility over the long run, building the world's food supply, increasing its nutrition, and capturing the carbon at the same time. Now, you can argue that scale is the problem here. But in fact, the IPCC did studies recently under Professor Mumma from Tufts University and costed it out, not just in terms of active agricultural production, but the reclamation of grasslands. If you rethink herding on grasslands, right, from domestics through the ungulates in the African plains, you can switch the carbon release, which we're currently fostering, to carbon capture.
Thank you. Panelists, you want to take that one on?
All I know is we're going to need to get rid of a very large amount of CO2 over this century, and we're going to need to get rid of it permanently so that it doesn't leak back out again in the next century. I don't know how we're going to do that. I don't think anybody knows how we're going to do that. It's true that a tree is not a bad way of capturing carbon right now, but it also needs things like water, and it also tends to grow well in places that we might want to use to grow food. And so there are obvious tensions there. If, on the other hand, the world's largest industry, and I keep repeating this because I think it's very important to remind ourselves of the fact that we are dealing with the world's largest industry. If the world's largest industry were looking for ways to get rid of CO2, they'll find it. They will find them. I'm very confident about that because this is an industry that's proved itself incredibly resilient at finding new ways of doing things. You know, the oil started to run out, they went and started fracking. You know, there's so many ways in which this industry has responded to technical challenges. On this one, I will just take one issue with the idea that we do this with a carbon tax. I don't think any conceivable carbon tax would actually motivate the scale of carbon dioxide disposal that we need to actually solve the problem. But let me just give you before that makes you feel gloomy, you can cheer up by noting that the world's largest CO2 disposal project, which comes on stream this year in a country, Australia, which is not known for its progressive stance on climate, mainly implemented by Chevron, a company that's also not known for its progressive stance on climate. It's the Gorgon gas facility, where they're going to be re-injecting CO2 underground on the largest scale of any facility around in the world. The reason they're doing it is because they were told by the Western Australian state government to do it as a licensing condition for developing the gas. And as somebody who was in the room said to me, we thought about it for 5 minutes and we said yes. If it was made a licensing condition of continuing to dig up fossil carbon that you get rid of the CO2, the industry would solve the problem.
Comments? Claire, Varun?
Well, I mean, basically,
I recognise this is a minority view.
No, I don't think it is. I think it's a good idea. You know, let's do that. Well, who's going to do that? How do we get that to happen? Oh, I think we're going to need everyone in this room demanding it to happen. And so that's why we need the societal pressure to get these types of shifts to happen. On the land use, you know, I worked in forestry for quite a long time. The best way to change, and indeed in grasslands as well, rangelands, the best way to change the decisions, the way things happen at the local level, is to give them, to give local communities rights to that forest. They immediately start to protect it. They prevent people coming in and stealing the timber. Likewise, if you give pastoralists rights, reciprocal rights they have to be for pastoralists, but rights over their grazing land, they actually change the way that they manage it. You get a lot more carbon sequestration, but it's never going to solve the volume of the problem that we have right now. It's great, it's all good, and the agricultural shifts that need to be made, yep, lots happening at the moment. The problem is that a lot of the people that are engaged in climate-smart agriculture see this as a technical problem that can be solved just purely with innovation in seeds and so on. It's a risk problem. Farmers struggle with a lot of risk. They're facing everyday risks about current climate variability, let alone the type of increase in extreme events. They don't adopt new technologies when they're under positions of extreme risk. We have to reduce the risk to enable them to take up some of the opportunities. But yes, you can sequester a lot more carbon than we are at the moment, and we can shift from fossil fuel intensive agriculture, but we've known this for a long time. I'm feeling a bit tired, I'm afraid, but it's a bit like, actually we need demand. We need people demanding the change, and we need giving the right people rights. We need to be managing the risk differently, and then we'll get the shifts we need.
Good, thank you. We're nearly done. Cameron.
So last month I convened a group in this room, actually, including the chief executive of Shell and a few other chief executives, and his head of new energies made the point that would resonate with you, Miles, that they are a big consumer player. They have more retail outlets than Starbucks. They understand consumers. And his claim, which is not a claim that we would have heard yesterday from Bill McKibben, is that they can actually turn the ship around and solve this problem. So my question to you all is, do you think that the big fossil fuel players will actually become the engines of the answer to this challenge? Miles, you may do so, I don't know. Or do you think they really just need to be crushed?
You want to take a stab?
You go, and then I'll, yeah.
I just did a bunch of research on oil companies in solar in particular. So let me share some of the thoughts. I had. Oil companies were responsible for some of the early commercialization of solar power. For example, Exxon used solar on its offshore oil platforms because it had no other good way of powering them. Over the next 20 years, so in the 1980s, 1990s, 2 of the top 4 solar manufacturers became, or were oil companies. And then in a mass exodus, oil companies just left solar, and they haven't come back yet. One kind of has. Total owns SunPower. But in general, and others are investing in new companies, but in general, oil companies are kind of scared of solar. I personally believe that they could play an important role in the future. And I think the lack of large corporate entities in energy innovation, the lack of corporate strategic investment to complement, for example, venture capital investment, is one of the reasons that we've had so many failed innovative energy ventures in comparison, for example, with the biomedical sector or with the software sector. I don't know how to get them interested again, but I would say that it could be a strategic hedge for many of them. You see Statoil making a play on offshore wind turbines, for example. And somebody here mentioned it. In a post-oil economy, if we believe we'll get there, it will be important for them to diversify their sources of revenue.
Good. Claire, do you want to address that as well?
Yeah, was at the Sustainable Energy for All conference the week before last, I think it was, and there were quite a few oil companies there. Straight afterwards, we went into a closed room and had an event, collaboration with Chatham House event, so I can't tell you who said what, but there were oil companies there. There were countries representing the new producers, those that have found recent finds in oil and gas. And the question was, in this world of constrained carbon, what is the solution for those countries that have just found oil and gas, like Tanzania and Mozambique? Do they extract fast because if they don't get it out the ground, they're going to find nobody wants it? Or do they extract slowly because they'll have the right to extract for longer because they didn't cause the problem in the first place? And it was just, geopolitics. What's everyone think? Basically, the oil companies are concerned. This is the right moment. Statoil was at Esty for All talking about what they see as how they're going to turn their company around so that they are the most efficient oil and gas company. Shell has also been saying the same thing, that all of their directors are only going to get their money, sorry, I'm tired. So
we're nearly done.
Bonuses, thank you. They're only going to get their bonuses if they deliver efficiency. So things are shifting. I think this is an important moment. But I do think that when we're talking about these, part of this is around the governance of these issues. And if we changed the license to operate, if we all said we won't buy our petrol from BP because they're not part of doing this, then that would make a difference. It's also about the governance of not having unintended consequences elsewhere. So I do think that in some of these geoengineering solutions, the solar radiation one, there should be a panel of something which allows the poorest countries also to have a voice about the technologies being driven. And likewise, you can get some instability in earthquake zones through pumping things back into the ground. We should have some sort of governance for these new technologies.
Thank you. So a question over here, and I think that's probably all we can handle. So.
Hi, my name is Joanna. I'm doing a master's in public policy here and a Rhodes Scholar class of 2015. My question is for Claire, and it has to do with the label climate change, or more broadly, maybe how we're framing the problem of climate change. Yesterday, you mentioned in your talk that when you told a non-supporter of climate change that you worked in the climate change space, sort of the conversation was sometimes less constructive. But when you said I work in waste management or water management, the dialogue changed in more of a constructive, positive direction. And so the question is, if gaining support from non-supporters is of interest in order to move from a place of conversation to action, should we drop the term climate change completely and label this something different?
To get change to happen, I think it's really important to use the language of the person you're trying to persuade to act. So if their interest is in energy security, then let's talk about energy security. It's actually the same thing. If their interest is in, this issue about the households, when you're told, basically some analysis has been done. Why don't people act on global problems? Because they don't see it as their problem. Do they act when they're told it's a neighbourhood problem and they have to do better than their neighbour? Yes, they do. That's the most effective way of making people change. It's talking about their street. It's not talking about their village, their town, their county, their country, or the world. It's talking about their street. So if we could start using all this new technology, smart grids and so on, and actually saying, oh, Mr. Smith down the road is doing better than you on X, people would be motivated to act. So how can we change the nature of the debate to be one about you and your locality and not so much about these global long-term trends which people don't care about?
Thank you. Well, I think that we should probably finish there. And obviously, we've only scratched the surface on these really important topics. And I hope that this is a dialogue that will continue from here. But I'd like to thank all of the panelists and all of you for being here. So thank you very much. Are you going to say final words as our convener? Okay. Don't have much choice.
I'm on the spot now. Thank you, Charles. Well, look, we've had a wonderful couple of days. Thank you to all of you who have participated. Thanks in particular to the Rhodes scholars who actually organized these last 2 days, including this final panel, getting the 4, now 3, of the wonderful panelists that we had was always going to be an exercise in skill, talent, and a degree of diplomacy. And enabling Charles to find the time to chair it is something that we're very grateful. We're grateful to you, Charles, and I'm grateful to the scholars who made this all happen. So as an Australian Rhodes Scholar, with a Prime Minister who recently addressed our Houses of Parliament with his Treasurer holding a lump of coal, and speaking from the country that is possibly about to see financial close of the world's largest new coal mine, I think this issue hits us and me very hard, but it hits all of us in our own particular way. One of the most inspiring things I'll take away from the 2 days, and it is also true of this panel, is that there is action that each of us can take individually. Our action can trigger the action of others, particularly in a world of much greater transparency, social networks, and ways of leveraging your impact. And if you are concerned about this issue, don't walk away and think, well, that was interesting, and I'll go back to my day job. Have a think about what you can take, whether it was Wangari Maathai planting some trees and getting some of the most weak people in the planet, most disempowered people to plant trees and create a movement that delivers mass planting of trees, whether it's building an app, whether it's doing whatever it is you do. We've had a number of fantastic ideas in the last 2 days. I may even be about to join a couple of boards to help to deliver them. And I would urge you all to take action as well in your own special way. But I'd like to finally thank Charles, thank the Rhodes Trust, thank Rhodes House, and thank the panelists for an excellent final close to what has been a stimulating 2 days. Thank you very much.